For years, I've been reviewing iPhone cameras as if they're standalone pieces of camera equipment, but at least half of what I've been shooting with them are pictures of my cat. So I do wonder if I'm being overly serious with these reviews. But then again, they're cat photos, so of course I'm gonna be serious. This is actually the first time in 7 years we're seeing a resolution bump for the iPhone's main camera. Since the 6S, that's always been 12 megapixels, and this time the increment is straight up fourfold all the way to 48 megapixels, which does make this generation quite a historical one. To put that magical pixel count of 48 million into perspective, that is a very comparable pixel count against many of today's favorite high-end mirrorless cameras. But as many photographers would know, a high-resolution sensor is worthless if your lens does not have enough resolving power for it, which was the case I was mentally prepared for, but pleasantly I was proven to be wrong. The full-resolution photos are spectacularly detailed. In the camera app though, you do have to enable the ProRAW format to get that 48 megapixel resolution, but if say you just wanted to take 48 megapixel photos in just JPEG or HEIF, you can actually do that, but in third-party apps like Halide. A 48 megapixel image in HEIF is only about 10 megabytes compared to around 60 for ProRAW. But the 14 Pro will still default to being a 12 megapixel shooter. It's been designed in a way that shooting in 48 megapixels has to be a conscious and deliberate action. And by your own choice, it's also more than likely that the majority of your shots are still going to be in 12 megapixels for some pretty good reasons, mainly related to one big new thing. The new quad pixel sensor on the iPhone 14 Pro's main cameras are 65% larger than the conventional Bayer sensors on the iPhone 13 Pros. When it comes to sensor sizes, bigger is almost always better, but despite the significantly bigger sensor, the 14 Pros actually have smaller pixels than the 13 Pro due to that huge increment in resolution. Now typically this would mean bad news for low light performance, but is it? Here are some side-by-sides against the 13 Pro in low light. Main camera, of course, with night mode forced to off, so we're comparing the native low light performance. We're pitching 12 megapixels against a 48 megapixel sensor in 12 megapixel mode, and the 14 Pro not only looks more detailed, but also has less noise. But then this smug Asian dude just say it had smaller pixels. Well, this calls for a brief moment to appreciate the tech found on the iPhone 14 Pro. The quad pixel sensor on the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max is a sensor design that groups 4 of the same colored photo sites together. They can be sampled individually for a greater pixel count, or combine the signal from the 2x2 clusters for what is in theory an image signal 4 times stronger, but at a quarter of the maximum resolution. This results in greater sensitivity, hence better low light performance. Without getting overly technical about it, you can imagine the main camera as having 2 modes, a high resolution mode and a high sensitivity mode. Mutually exclusive, one or the other. To show you how big of an impact this has, we're going to take 2 identical shots in extreme low light, one in 48 megapixels, one in 12. For the best consistency, we'll shoot both in ProRAW, where there's an option to choose your ProRAW resolution. In this particular situation, the 48 megapixel shot looks quite frankly like a train wreck, horribly noisy, unusable, but here's the exact same shooting conditions just in 12 megapixels. Instantly, it is miles better. So honestly, I do think this is a genius design. When you've got so much resolution, you can afford to trade some of it for low light performance when the situation calls for it. Now, from my experience, this difference in low light capabilities is only this apparent under extreme low light conditions. Even in moderately low light, such as dimly lit indoors, you're not going to notice a significant loss of image quality should you choose to shoot at full 48 megapixels. My bottom line is, for anything not dark enough to require night mode, feel absolutely safe to shoot in high resolution mode. Now, to be fair, the 14 Pro does have the added benefit of the new photonic engine when compared against the 13 Pro. I've actually got a dedicated video talking about just that, and I'm not going to point it out right here in the corner, because I'll sneakily put it in the end screen so you finish watching this review first. But shooting the main camera at 12 megapixels also has the benefit of a streamlined multi-camera experience on the 14 Pro, because aside from the main camera being 48 megapixels, every other camera on this is capped at 12 megapixels. The Face ID camera doesn't count, by the way. Actually, I do not know the resolution of the Face ID camera. But that main shooter, being 48 megapixels, has actually brought back one of my absolute favorite things to the Pro iPhone, the 2x camera. Now, this is essentially a 50mm lens, and because it shares the same minimum focusing distance as the 1x camera, technically they are the same camera, so it makes for an excellent medium close-up shooter. The 2x camera is also now my favorite way to use portrait mode. With the 3x, I constantly have to step back in order for portrait mode to kick in properly. On the 2x, that detection distance is the most forgiving, and composition-wise, it's not too wide nor too tight, so very comfortable for framing up on a subject. And since iOS 16, the portrait mode processing has been enhanced so that if there's something in the foreground, it gets nicely blurred out as well. But every time you fire up the camera app, that 4-up selection of focal lengths is such a lovely sight. When you switch between 1x and 2x cameras, although they are the same camera, the sensor has to switch from high sensitivity mode in 1x to high resolution mode in 2x to maintain 12 megapixels. This transition is seamless for the most part, but you know me, I like to go looking for things. So here we go. When it's really dark, you'll see the noise pattern flash for a split second as the sensor changes its sampling mode. For anything up to 1.9x, the main camera will sample in the high sensitivity but low resolution mode, so that means whenever your zoom is set between 1x and 2x, it's actually cropping in from a 12 megapixel frame. But this difference in the way the sensor is sampled between 1x and 2x does also mean the 1x wide camera is still superior to the 2x camera in low light despite sharing the exact same hardware. Again, not really that much of a difference unless you're in really challenging low light. If that happens to be the case, however, my suggestion is to punch out wide, then move in close to your subject for the cleanest image. And the duality of this main sensor again results in one of my favorite improvements in video mode. It's always been the case on iPhones when shooting in 4K 60p, you're committed to the camera you initiated recording on, meaning if I started recording using the 1x camera, I cannot jump to the 0.5x or 3x camera mid-roll. I should make it clear that this limitation is only present in 4K 60p, but here on the 14 Pro, because the 1x and 2x cameras are indeed the same camera, you can go between them when recording 4K 60. So suddenly I have access to a lossless zoom when shooting video. Whilst recording, the sensor will still do its thing, changing sampling modes as you hit 2x. That means cleaner videos in low light on 1x and maintaining sharp detailed 4K in 2x. You'll also notice a much smoother transition when changing focal lengths compared to the iPhone 13 Pro. That includes going between entirely different cameras as well. It was more of a flash on the 13s, whereas the 14s do this graceful zoom. There are two modes, however, where you will find the 2x camera to not be available, and those modes are cinematic mode and slow motion. Bit of a bummer for cinematic mode not getting 2x, so hopefully you'll be seeing that at least on future iPhones. If you're concerned about night mode, however, not to worry, you do get night mode on the 2x camera. In fact, every camera is equipped with night mode on the iPhone 14 Pro. Night mode portraits, however, are still limited exclusively to the 1x camera. If you're on the 2x camera in portrait mode and you're in low light, the camera app will recommend that you zoom out for night mode. I was also excited to see whether or not we'll be seeing 48 megapixel night mode shots out of this, since you can take night mode photos in ProRAW, but whenever you do shoot night mode in ProRAW, it will always capture in 12 megapixels. So for the time being, no 48 megapixel night mode photos yet. Having the main camera serve two focal lengths now, the metadata now refers to it as main camera instead of what was traditionally wide camera on the 13 Pro. So regardless you shoot in 1x or 2x, metadata shows that you shot it with the main camera. It still shows the correct equivalent focal length in case you'd like to check if you shot in 1x or 2x. You might also notice a small detail here, that the 1x camera is now a 24mm equivalent instead of a 26mm back on the 13 Pro. It is a slight but noticeably wider field of view on the 14 Pro. Practically though, outside of comparisons like this, it will not make a difference when you're shooting with it. On the 14 Pros, the main camera is also an f1.78 aperture, slightly darker than the 13 Pro's f1.5. My theory is the lens would physically be too big if Apple was to maintain f1.5 with this much bigger sensor, but pragmatically this still produces better results in low light, so I've got no complaints. Clearly, there's been massive upgrades to the main camera for the 14 Pro, but that's far from being the only camera that got upgraded. It might not be the most apparent, but there's an entirely new ultra-wide-angle camera on the 14 Pro. If anything, when you compare it on paper with the ultra-wide on the 13 Pro, something seems very off, because the 14 Pro has the darker aperture of f2.2 versus f1.8 from last year. That is indeed the truth, but something very important that the spec sheet does not tell you is the ultra-wide on the 14 Pro has a sensor nearly twice the size. So despite having a darker aperture, photos in low light are still cleaner versus the 13 Pro. Still though, I stand by what I said about this not being the most apparent upgrade, because you're really not going to notice a whole lot of difference on the ultra-wide for the most part. I'd say the most visible improvement happens during macro shooting. When you bring subjects up to its insanely close minimum focus, you can see fine texture being rendered with more clarity compared to the 13 Pro. But ever since that 13 Pro, shooting macro with the ultra-wide was something I genuinely enjoyed because it's such a unique perspective considering most professional macro lenses have tight field of views. And being able to use this for videos as well, it is one of the biggest allures for choosing the Pro version of the iPhone 14s. But across the board, there are some juicy video upgrades for all iPhone 14s, such as 4K being available now for cinematic mode. This has certainly been a reason for me to use cinematic mode a lot more, because back on my 13 Pro I would have to choose between either having 4K or using cinematic mode. On the 14s, you can have both. Plus, 24 FPS cinematic mode is an option currently exclusive to the 14s, and with the arrival of the 14s also comes a feature completely new to iPhones, action mode. It truly is an insane degree of digital stabilization, and due to the way it works by cropping your image in, we are trading field of view and resolution for buttery smooth footage. Just bear in mind your framing is going to be much tighter in action mode. The software is aware of this and will default to the ultra-wide, which in action mode looks only like a slightly wider version of the main camera. You can record up to 60p in action mode at a pretty unconventional resolution of 2816 by 1584. If this video is in 4K and this box is 1080p, then this is how big an action mode video is. For any form of digital video stabilization, any motion blur induced by camera shake will completely ruin the effect. So it only makes sense that the iPhone camera app locks in a very fast shutter speed whenever you're in action mode. This would, however, unavoidably mean that you would need a lot of light in order for this to work. Mostly this means sunny outdoors, so for any action happening indoors, it's very unlikely to be bright enough for action mode to work. To be fair, the cinematic stabilization that gets applied in good old video mode is already good enough for pretty effortless handheld shooting. Interestingly enough, action mode can be used across all the rear-facing cameras, meaning you can get an ultra-stabilized tight shot with the 3x telecamera. And one of my favorite ways of using action mode is to actually take things slow. You can get these very controlled movements that seem like they were shot using sliders and dollies, where in fact they were done using a pair of jittery hands in action mode. There is one more camera worth talking about, and it's this one we all sometimes use as a mirror. It's been upgraded with a brighter aperture, so yes, it's better in low light, but that, in my opinion, is dwarfed by the fact that it can now autofocus. Everything you shoot with it, from selfies to FaceTime calls, are all in sharp focus now, and it does make a visibly massive difference in detail, which may or may not be flattering if you've got a face like mine. But I would say this is the first time I can look at an image taken on the front camera and not instantly tell it was shot on the front camera. Minimum focus is just over 3 inches, so you can selfie with your face right into the camera. I've of course exploited this to take unflattering photos of my cat. My cat told me the other day that he thinks the cameras on the iPhone 14 Pros are underrated, and I get where he's coming from. This is a combination of both hardware and software improvements which stack up to make the camera system as a whole a tremendous upgrade. And to some extent it might have become more capable than what an average user might ask for, but if it's gonna be that one camera we document our daily lives with, might as well make it count.